Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today as we talk to you about how to use project and change management for digital transformation. I'm Karina Creedon. I lead Forbes Mazar's nonprofit advisory services practice unit for nonprofits, and also lead our digital technology strategy and innovation team. I am an auditor by trade originally and a CPA, but for the last 20 years or so, I have been working in project management and outsourced CFO and special projects, working with nonprofit executives and finance leaders to establish within their finance departments the most efficient and effective solutions for accurate and appropriate financial reporting within their organizations to get them the most meaningful information that they can to make better decisions with the information that they have. And our DTSI team works with our nonprofit clients along the full path of their digital transformation journeys. Today, I'm joined by Andrew Haro, and I'm going to turn it over to him as we talk to you about using the project management and change management as they're layered together within your digital transformation journey. Andrew?
Thank you, Karina. As you said, I am Andrew Faro. I'm a director here out of our New York office at Forbes Mazars. Just a little bit of my background. So I started as an auditor, then went over from tax, and then figured public accounting had given me everything it could. So I actually went and ran a accounting department at a nonprofit and experienced a lot of change, especially during COVID, and then left my nonprofit to kind of come into consulting to help more nonprofits as we go through. But kind of delving in what the agenda here is today. So we'll go over some objectives. Then we're going to kind of hit on at a high level, what is change management? I think as we've talked even internally within our firm and to some of our clients and colleagues, it's kind of this nebulous term that seems to be a catch-all for anything anybody wants. So we're going to kind of define it so that we have a road path forward at really what we see it as and how we've seen it help our clients, both in process changes, but also technological changes. Then talking a little bit about change management versus project management, how they are different things. And we're seeing that a lot more as we go through these projects that we'll talk about and how to kind of align them together for those best outcomes. And then obviously with all that information, everybody on this call is going to be ready and raring to go. So we're just going to give some areas of where to start, because I think like most of the things we talk about when it comes to change, there's so many places to start that sometimes it's just, okay, where is the low-hanging fruit? Or for some organizations, it's, hey, we need to sit down and make a strategic plan. I was actually on the phone with somebody this morning, and they're just like, we know we need change. I just don't know how expansive that change needs to be. And really helping to develop that path forward and that roadmap, I think is key in some of our clients and some of the organizations we work with. So really hitting on our objectives to kind of figure out what we hope you take away from this. So the first one is defining those key differences between project management and change management. I think a lot of times those get used interchangeably, and I think that does a disservice to both. So kind of defining what we see those as and how they play a role, especially in this digital transformation we're seeing a lot of today. The next one is identifying how good project and change management can help facilitate that successful, smooth digital transformation. And I think this will hit on a key theme we'll talk about a lot today is there is no such thing as a linear change or a 100% perfect implementation or digital transformation. There's always going to be a bump in the road. And how project and change management can go hand in hand to smooth out those bumps and help you end up with that higher adoption. And the last thing is describe some steps your organization can take to set the course for a thriving, inclusive change management process. And I think that word inclusive does a lot of work in that sense, and we'll hit on that. But I think the best change management we see from our clients and organizations we talk to is that inclusivity, bringing the right people to the table, I think really helps. So that brings us to kind of our first topic. What is change management? And funny enough, I told my wife what I was presenting on today, and she said, so you speak about it at work, but don't do it at home. So I have always been somebody, funny enough, that hasn't liked change. I'm very set in my ways, but as I've come into my professional career, I realize that change is necessary. And those who don't change usually get left behind. But I think it's what I crave in my personal life, and you can't really with a 2.5 year old daughter, but what I crave in my personal life is that change, that well thought out change, that we're going to do this right. And thinking about what the organizations that we work with need. Like I said, no change is linear. And anytime you go through a change, there's going to be bumps in the road. But how can change management and those philosophies and those practices really help you enact that end vision? Make sure you're hitting your goal. And I think this is where our expertise in nonprofits really come into play, because I think nonprofits are very, very adverse to change. No one likes to change because a lot of nonprofits go, it's working. I don't really want to take a step back and figure it out. And I think taking that time to think through change, to explain why it's a good thing, I think is really helpful for a lot of the organizations we work with. Going to the next slide. So what is change management, and really how is it different from that project management? So the way we define it, and I know we're going to hit on it a lot, I'm going to use the idea of changing your accounts payable system. We see that as kind of an easy thing. A lot of nonprofits, a lot of organizations need that automation. You see all these things with AI and processing. How can I automate my accounts payable? Get bills paid, know what I have to pay. So thinking about that whole cycle, when I think about project management, that's when you get into an implementation with a software, with a vendor. They give you that list of things. So week one, we're going to get your list of vendors. Week two, we're going to get your approval stream. Week three, we're going to teach you how to use the system. Week four, we go live. And that is project management. It's maintaining that checklist, maintaining that the system is set up correctly, that you're going to be able to get your bills into the system and make your bills. Focus on the activities that go on in a change. What are we doing? How are we training? What is the outcome we want? What are the requirements we need to set up the system? Do we have to go through KYC? Do we have to set up a new email address? That's really where we see that project management. On the flip side of that is that change management. And this is kind of different. That's where it's sitting down as an organization. What is our plan? What are our end goals? And really coming up with like a project charter. What are we working towards? And I think a lot of that change management is focused on changing the behavior of an organization. We always say when we go into a new organization, 9 times out of 10, all the problems are people, process, and systems. And especially working with a nonprofit organization, it's almost going to be always going to be process or systems, because I still haven't found a nonprofit accounting department that's overstaffed. So there you go. But working with those people to figure out, how do we get to where we want to go? Who do we bring to the table? What is that communication we need to have? What is that engagement? How do we work within our organization to change and make sure that people feel included in the change? I think, especially coming from a finance role, especially at nonprofits where people are so mission driven, there is a view from finance that we know why we need to change, let's just enact it. But sometimes bringing those program people to the table to explain the change, to help them understand, sometimes you can get more adoption by bringing to the table and really working with them for that behavior change and letting them know why. We just see a lot better adoption. And that's really where the difference between that project management and that change management is. Change management, I see, is bringing the organization along to execute the vision, whereas project management is setting that system up. So I'm going to turn it over to Karina. I know you're having some Wi-Fi issues, so I have to jump in. Just let me know. But really, why these go hand in hand when we talk about project and change management and how they work together.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks for setting that up. So I think that when we're contemplating the idea of change management versus project management, it'll be useful to evaluate it along a couple of different indices, right? We know that they work hand in hand, and we know that, as Andrew said, they really focus on different aspects of the organizational initiatives, right? Andrew talked about the concept of behaviors versus tasks. And so when we think about it over the next few slides, I'm going to focus on 5 significant concepts, right? The first is the lens through which either project management or change management is focused. The second would be the breadth or the narrowness of each of those paths focuses. Then I want to talk about the tools that we use in change versus project management. Then I think it's important to even think about the nomenclature and the verbiage of the roles and responsibilities of the individuals that are on the change management path versus the project management path. And then lastly, thinking about what does success look like and how do we measure success? So when we go on to the next slide, we're going to start first with project management. So, why is project management important? Um, this is fairly obvious, as Andrew already teed up for us. This is where we are crafting our plan. And when we think about what the focus is, here, these are standard terms, right? We're maintaining our budget, we have our timeliness, we're documenting steps. When we're talking about that focus, which is that first indices I talked about, we're thinking about the planning, the executing, the activities of closing the project, working on those tasks. It's ensuring that the project goals are actually met on time, within scope, within budget, and the budget would be not only dollars, but also within the context of hours and resources. Then thinking about that second indices, which is scope. This is a lot more focused, right? Because we're talking about those specific tasks and they're very concrete, right? And you've got deliverables and you've got milestones along the path of that budget. As Andrew was mentioning, perhaps with respect to AP, have we, migrated all of our vendor data over? Have we identified all of our underlying accounts payable aging from the subledger? Has that been migrated over? And those are actual concrete tasks and concrete deliverables that need to be migrated over at a certain point in time, right? Then we're thinking about the next indices, which is the tool and techniques. In project management, we're thinking about the methodology by which we're going to do that. A lot of times when we're talking about project management, we're talking about Gantt charts. You're talking about project management software. Some of you may have heard about Microsoft Project or Asana, some of those, fairly common software platforms that are used to manage time and people and resources in order to make sure that you're staying on task, on budget, within your calendarized concept of when you need to complete all of your tasks. Then let's think about the verbiage that we use and how we define the people that are associated with project management. You've got your roles, you've got your project manager, you've got your team members, you've got your stakeholders. These are all of the individuals that are associated with project management. And then lastly, in terms of defining success, like what does success look like in a successfully implemented project? That is going to be when the project is implemented within with the defined deliverables, within the defined timeline, and you have, an understanding of what those dates are, what the milestones are. There is a cutover date. There are, actual deliverables and outputs that need to be produced, and those are done on time, on budget, or if there are change orders that have happened, because very often, nothing goes exactly to plan, but those are able to be defined and then we can measure against them, right? And so that's how project management fits into the context of, any type of, project. But let's go now to the next slide and let's think about change management and how that's slightly different, right? Change management, this is where, as Andrew mentioned, we're talking more about that behavioral concept, right? And this is where we're talking about, this is where the employees are coming in and it's about their behavior, about attracting and retaining employees, about creating those efficiencies, about mission consistency, particularly now when we're talking about in the context of our nonprofit environment. We need to be very mindful of this isn't only a task or a set of tasks and a set of deliverables that need to be accomplished, but it also needs to be accomplished within the context of the culture and the mission of the organization and the people with whom you work, right? And so when we're thinking again about that focus, the focus is going to be on the management of the human side of the change. That's ensuring that the individuals and the teams adopt those new processes, they adopt those new technologies, and that organization wide change. The scope is typically much broader. That's going to encompass the broader impact of the change on the individuals, their teams, the culture, and also the organizational behavior, right? Because all of that needs to go in to make sure that we're going to get total adoption and organization wide adoption of whatever it is that our end process goal is designed to be the outcome. With respect to the tools that's going to be used and the techniques in order to implement this change management, that's going to be more of those frameworks like a communication plan. You're going to be looking at training programs. And you're also going to be looking at the concept of resistance management. And that's something we're going to talk about in a little while when we're talking about making sure that people are engaged. And we are also addressing the concept of potential resistance to that new way of doing things or new mode or method, whether it be a paradigm shift or it be an actual tool or a software or a platform that we're looking to implement. When you're talking about the roles of people who will be engaged, this is where Andrew had mentioned, is there a charter? Well, along with a charter, there's usually some type of steering committee. There's some kind of change manager. There's perhaps a change agent. There's a sponsor for the program. You also have the employees who are working in and with any one of these people, both on the project management side, but also fundamentally throughout the change management piece as well, because they're key and critical to this whole process, of course. And then the outcome, how do we define success? How do we view success? How do we measure success? That's going to be that smooth, hopefully, smooth transition and smooth adoption of change, that minimizing of resistance and maximizing of engagement across and throughout the organization. So while project management and change management often work hand in hand, we can see that each path prioritizes different aspects of that organizational initiative. They have slightly different objectives. And whereas project management is looking to deliver on the project successfully, change management is looking to ensure that the change is embraced and sustained by the people who are impacted. The approach on project management is more task oriented and focused on those processes, those deliverables, whereas change management is people oriented and it's focused on that behavior and that culture. And then in terms of timeline, project management is going to be having a defined start, a defined end, which might be altered if there are changes along the way. Whereas change management can and should extend well beyond the project timeline.
Made multiple. What was the biggest? We're just trying to get a gauge. We see a lot of different organizations doing a different thing, so we just try to estimate where they're coming from. So give it a few minutes. So then going into our next point, so those are the difference between project and change management, and really thinking about what are some good pillars of change management. So I think project management, Karina talked about it, having those Gantt charts, those systems that kind of track your deliverables to make sure that at the end of the day, you're ready for go live, you understand the system. And I know we're harping a lot, but we're seeing a lot more system changes. So thinking about what you need to do in terms of good change management and how to do that. So like I said, most of what we're seeing is a lot of system related changes. So that's 43%, and then process and people. And then 23% said no. So you've kind of stayed the course, and maybe you do need that change, and this is kind of the wake-up call. But thinking about good change management. So there's kind of four things we see, and it all centers around that communication. How do you communicate it? How do you bring about this change in the best possible way? So thinking about clear, measurable outcomes is the project charter. I know we keep talking about this, but you're going into a new project with either a new process or a new system, and really bringing about that project charter and how you can go about knowing what you want at the end of the day and knowing how to kind of work through it, I think is key. That's kind of having that project charter, and as you go through the implementation and the integration, really thinking about, am I getting my outcomes at the end of the day, and kind of always refreshing and re-looking at that charter to make sure that you are moving towards what you want. Because I think it's really key as you go through any change, there's going to be bumps in the road, as we keep saying, and making sure that as those bumps come up, you're still moving in the same direction and you're still moving towards that common outcome, those common goals, the reason you're investing in this change. So, really making that true. Number two is having that defined ownership, making sure that throughout your company or organization that you have a clear person who has signed off on the change, who's owning this process, who is working towards it to make sure that at the end of the day, there is a decision maker. I always say it's great to have a steering committee. It's great to have as much buy-in as possible. But at the end of the day, sometimes somebody needs to make a decision and own it, because you can have all the committee meetings you want, and sometimes you are going to end up with a 50-50 split of a vote. And at the end of the day, either a CFO, a COO, a CEO, a board needs to step in and make that decision to move the organization forward. I always say you can't plan enough, but there comes a time where you're just having the same conversation over and over, and a decision needs to be made. The next one is organizational buy-in, and really taking a step back and figuring out who needs to be on this table, who needs to be at the table, making sure if you're talking about going back to the accounts payable example, well, if your program people in the field are going to be the ones who have to use the system to enter bills, to make sure their vendors get paid, they should be a part of that selection process to make sure that they're okay with what they're going to have to do to get their bills in. Because at the end of the day, you can choose the best system, but if your people in the field aren't willing to use it, you're not going to have buy-in and you're not going to have adoption. So making sure you bring the right people to the table in order to make sure that the decision, you get the biggest buy-in and end up with that greater adoption and use of whatever change you have. The last thing you want to do as an organization or a company is come in, make these big sweeping changes and have them not be sticky. The more buy-in you get, whether it's through a survey, a steering committee, open demos, videos of demos so people can ask questions, you get more stickiness to that change because people feel like they have some ownership in it. And I think the last piece I would say is one of the biggest when it comes to nonprofit organizations that we see failed changes always usually come back to this, at least in my experience, is a uniform vision. And I think that that's tricky because I think at nonprofits, there's a finite resources, whether it's money or time. And not everybody in an organization is going to want to spend money on a new accounting system because that 25 grand could go to help an after school program. But you know what? In order to get the data we need to spend the money here. But I think having a management team that while they might not agree on what they're doing, outwardly and to the rest of the organization is in lockstep and has a uniform vision of where you're going and everybody's bought in, it just leads to higher adoption, better change management, because then there's not conflicting reports. Because if you're trying to institute a new HR system and your COO just is talking to his people and goes, you know what, I really don't like the choice they made, but everybody else in the organization is on board, the people under the COO aren't as invested in this change because they know their boss doesn't like it, and maybe this change won't stick. So working together to have that uniform vision, I really think is key. And these are just some pillars that if they can be tied together along with good communication, really we see that end up of adoption at a higher rate. These organizations, when there are those peaks and valleys of any implementation, any change, they're just a little smooth. Going back to the childhood example, there are more ladders than there are chutes if you have good change management. So now, Karina, if you have your audio back, we'll go over to where change management goes wrong.
All right, take two. So you guys are going to see a theme. So in this presentation, Andrew gets to deliver all of the when projects go good, and I get to deliver all of the when projects go bad. So Andrew got to tell you all about the good change management pillars. And I will tell you when change management goes wrong, and you will see the same that will happen when we talk about our case studies a little later on. So, with respect to, what happens when the guidelines and the bright line test that Andrew has laid out are not followed, what happens? Without organization wide, you know, interaction regarding the needs and outcomes of digital transformation, there is a risk of that siloed input. There are unmet needs when one department or one set of leadership or one set of stakeholders is responsible for putting in all of or communicating all of the needs for whatever the system is that's going to be designed, right? Without that broad input, digital transformation may not address the actual needs of different departments, different stakeholders, and then there's frankly missed opportunities for innovation. That limited input can stifle innovation, and it's going to have an impact because diverse perspectives are not going to be considered, since we're really talking to a very small sliver of the population within an organization, right? Next, when we're talking about, changing goals and rationale, without consistency in message and goals and measurement and effective, those roles within the change management hierarchy, everywhere from, the change management to the sponsor, as Andrew had said, if there's not clear buy-in and clear, consistent communication throughout and upward, in the hierarchy, then employees and everyone else who's along this, culture-wide or organization-wide communication, they lose what I call the thread. And the thread is what flows through project management in parallel and really ties all of the tasks to the outcomes meaning. And very frankly, that's what I consider that backbone of change management. So unless you have, absent some inflection point that is, really definable and explainable, that brings the project in a complete, makes it have a complete left turn at Albuquerque, and would make you understand why there was, a very big change in plan for this particular project. Perhaps there was, let's say, a pandemic unexpectedly, or there was a large unexpected donation to the positive, or an unplanned budgeting shortfall, or something like that. Changing the course of the project without, an explanation as to why is really going to derail that process by which everything else is built upon it. Obviously deviations are going to happen. Digital solutions may not fit as well as you had anticipated. The migration may not be as seamless as you had planned or as timely as you had planned. But one of Andrew's favorite things is saying that plan, and plan again. When you plan well and you communicate well, you can mitigate a lot of those effects of those unknowns. Absent that, that's when change management really starts to fall apart, right? So looking at that unwillingness to change specific processes, we talked a little bit about that resistance management before. When you have that increased resistance to change and a unwillingness and a low engagement throughout the population, oftentimes that comes from limited involvement throughout the organization, which we talked about in the beginning with that siloed approach. If there's a lack of goals and tracking of the outcomes, if the vision isn't centrally aligned, if it's not consistently communicated, that's what's going to lead to a greater resistance to change. People may feel that their concerns and ideas aren't valued. And this, again, is going to turn into that resistance, and it's going to have that unwillingness to implement this transformation. Because, Andrew and I see this every single day, month in and month out. These projects are costly. They are costly in terms of dollars. They are costly in terms of hours, in terms of resources, in terms of the opportunity cost of what your people could be doing with their time, not in terms of only their regular day job, but other projects they could be spending their time on and other innovations. And so if there isn't buy-in for this particular project for a whole host of reasons, then they could be thinking about what else they could be doing. And that's when you get employee pushback. That's when you get low morale. That's when you get poor adoption of new technologies and underutilization of the tools that you are implementing. You'll see skills gaps. You'll see people, resisting training or not fully embracing the training. And it really is kind of a chicken and the egg. Poor adoption leads to poor results. Poor results leads to distrust of the process and then discourages engagement and enthusiastic adoption for this project and then the next one. So it really is a vicious circle. Looking at that disjointed management alignment, when management and senior leadership or your board is not in step with the project management team and the change management team, or the wishes and the needs of the constituents that it's trying to serve and to improve, their working conditions, you have a tiered misalignment. And this is going to result in that strategic misalignment. And your transformation efforts are going to be impacted. It's going to lead to ineffective outcomes, and across the organization, you also may see a loss of trust, a loss of morale. That low trust and morale can make people feel undervalued and be undermotivated when it comes to initiating or seeing through on their tasks along the project management timeline, which again is intricately linked to change management with respect to communication and all of the other components along that path. Can lead to cost overruns. It can lead to wasted resources. Investments in technology that don't meet your organizational needs lead to wasted financial and human resources, which certainly is not the goal. And lastly, while it's not necessarily on this slide, poor change management impacts the organization from a competitive disadvantage perspective. The organization may fall behind other organizations who are more inclusive and adaptive in their digital transformation efforts. And, at the worst, we have seen, unfortunately, projects fail and or along some line of the spectrum of project failure or incompletion or derailment. And so those ineffective outcomes certainly will result in you not being able to deliver on the expected benefits that you had wanted to, leading to overall project dissatisfaction. So we can't stress enough why adhering to those pillars of good change management along with project management are so critically important. So moving on to our next slide, talking about effective project management. I think that a lot of this we've talked about before. Being flexible on your plan. We're going to set a plan, but none of it is set in concrete. You need to be aware of how things change on the ground as the conditions change, both with respect to the needs of your people, the needs of your project, the needs of the vendors with whom you're working. And then you need to reestablish your goals and communicate them. Clear communication is critical because in order to be able to establish and continually reestablish that buy-in with your team and their understanding so that they can implement and move forward on the design as well as their roles and responsibility along this path. They need to know what's expected of them. And then lastly, I think, making that reasonable project plan, one of the things that people forget all the time, or sometimes we can forget as change managers and project managers, is that there are alternate competing priorities that all of our people have in addition to this digital transformation project. They're going to have the monthly close. They're going to have cyclical reporting. They're going to have time off. They're going to have other external reporting that they have for programmatic and project and funder requirements. And so being mindful of when those times are and layering in your, project goals and deliverables and heavy intensive times around those is going to be a really smart way to make sure that you are intelligently scoping out your project in advance so that it doesn't compete excessively or inadvertently with those blackout periods. Andrew, we can jump on to the next slide.
So this case study was the good one, and I really think it was an organization who was very flexible. So the first project we did for them was very closed off in finance, and it was documenting their processes, documenting what they're doing, and trying to figure out a roadmap. And one of the things we heard during there was, hey, we don't have organizational input. The steering committee was all finance and all admin. And there was a lot of pushback. So the second project we had was putting in a new accounting system. And while my program people didn't care about an accounting system, they sure cared about the reports that came in at the end of the day. And there was a lot of work on their end in that second project as part of the change management to bring in the program voices. And you could just tell people were more excited about the change. There was a much more clear vision and a clear process because there was so much pushback from that first project that they saw that. And I think that's the biggest takeaway from our good case study is being able to adapt from project to project, but also getting it. And so that's a successful one. And I know, Karina, you're going to talk about an unsuccessful one. I'm going to launch the second polling question as you talk about that and talk about kind of a second case study where it didn't go.
Yes. Thanks. So like I said, he gets the good case studies. I get the poor case studies. But I think some of the key takeaways from this other project on which we worked was primarily that there was a very siloed environment. There was a lot of competing office politics within the organization. There was 3 different sets of stakeholders. There was the finance team, there was the development team who was looking to get some looking for system change of its own. And then there was the office of the CEO. And so actually, and then there was a fourth layer of interaction, which was IT department. And so with each 4 sets of those stakeholders, they were, instead of working in tandem, they were working very separately from each other. And that was problematic because when it was time to share information about the needs for the systems that they were looking to bring on, as well as be able to coordinate timelines, as well as to be able to, take ownership over different pieces of the project, that was not well received between and amongst each of those 4 sets of stakeholders. They also did not have a really good way of communicating their outstanding projects and their outstanding issues lists between each other and with their various vendors. So they had us in one role, and then they were, because they were very siloed from each other, they were hiring other sets of consultants to work on different projects that were tangentially related, but they did not have a good communication scheme. And so every time we got together as a leadership team, new objectives came up, which took people off task. And that confusion of priorities made time management difficult. It made the dollars budget management very, very difficult. And in the end, although they had started out in a really clear fashion because they had done a diagnostic and they had thought that they laid out their path at the very beginning of their project, because they had siloed off throughout the middle portion of their implementation. Unfortunately, they didn't follow the timeline and the roadmap that they themselves had set up. And they didn't share their successes and their established goals along the way. And it really served to isolate the staff and the rest of the organization from each other. And that lack of shared goal setting, I think, is ultimately what did them in. So it impacted their training, their stakeholder engagement, and ultimately their successful adoption for a number of different issues. So it was a wonderful organization, and there were some successes along the way, but unfortunately, there were certainly more than a few inefficiencies and ineffectivenesses, is that a word? Inefficiencies that got in the way. So thinking about our poll, I think that we just brought those up. Wonderful. Where to start? I think that goes back to you, Andrew.
Comes down to good area, identifying your areas for change. And I think having that strategic plan. I know there was a question in the chat, what if people don't have the right roles and responsibilities and push back? I think having that vision as an organization, knowing you're moving in the same direction, I think is key. And a lot of this comes back to strategic planning. I talk to so many organizations that are just like, we know we need change, we don't need to start. So let's roadmap all that change and figure out how to do it, how to go about it. Having that clear change plan with a vision. And then thinking about, and then once you have that change plan, bringing in that project management to make sure you're implementing changes and monitoring that progress. And I think having then the change management and project management going hand in hand and moving towards that clear vision, I think is really key, especially in an organization that maybe has had bad change or not, or has had no change. Bringing it slowly, making sure people understand that it's not change just for change's sake, it's moving towards something, I think is key when you think about where to start. And there's always little areas to start. And I mean, it can start anywhere. And that'll bring us to the third polling question as we get into it. What changes can you envision being able to apply these principles to? System, process, or even organizational structure? And I think, Karina, I'm going to turn it over to you to just, what are some areas that can be changed? Because it doesn't have to be big sweeping changes. Sometimes the small ones are the easiest.
Sure. I think that when you are identifying where you may find the most impactful areas for change, as Andrew said, it doesn't have to be something that rips down to the studs. An entire organization-wide function. And also, it might not be the most obvious. We have been called in a number of times by a finance department thinking that what they need to do first and foremost is to switch out their, start with either a wholesale ERP change, or at a minimum, they need to start with their general ledger. And after we talk to them a little bit, and we figure out what some of their biggest pain points are and where their people are spending the most time, it turns out, and there's a reason why Andrew used the accounts payable example so many times today. It turns out that just putting into place a new accounts payable system, or maybe if we can get a new HRIS system put in instead, that will have the widest impact on the most, the greatest number of people, even though it's something that isn't only finance related, because it's something that the most number of people touch every day, either because they are paying vendors, or because they're filling out their timesheets every day, or because they have reimbursable expenses because they travel. And so being able to evaluate where the pain points are that are either taking up the most amount of time, that are putting the organization at the most risk from a segregation of duties perspective, and really evaluating from a cost driver and time spent in implementation. When you do that risk and reward and you look at that return on investment perspective, what will make the most sense for the organization? Sometimes it's also talking about where they're going to get a mandate from their board or from their funders in order to get the dollars, to the capital to actually fund this transformation of X initiative. Sometimes that's someplace to start, because this may be a watershed moment. And in order to start with digital transformation as a concept, they need to get something that has a broader buy-in. So reviewing those external factors, could be something about, if they're thinking about some type of capital expansion, or they're thinking about, a way in which they can reach a broader number of individuals in the community. thinking about reviewing internal factors. Are we trying to change the way in which we reach out to our funders? Are we looking to change different types of programming? Are we looking simply to change the way that we interact in between our various departments? Um, we would like maybe to perform a gap analysis, and all of these items that we have here, up on the slide. These are not things that necessarily need to be done by, an external consultant. Anyone who is engaged and who wants to take ownership over this in the organization can really lead these discussions and start with it like just an internal focus about where are we seeing some pain points? Where are we seeing, which departments are we seeing struggles? Where are we seeing time spent? And then let's prioritize them. Let's prioritize them with respect to the amount of, human hours, FTE hours that it takes to get things done. And then ultimately someone needs to, make some decisions, because as Andrew said in the beginning, we have, all of these great options on the table, but if we're paralyzed by inertia, then nothing ever happens. Let's make some decisions about what our priorities going to be, which are the systems or are the evaluative tools that we're going to use to move forward with next, and then let's just plan and move ahead. So moving on to the next slide. Here's where we are actually going to be, after creating that change, now we're going to be implementing the change. And so, the good news is you've already done a lot of this planning, right? You've done the planning. You've followed your change, you followed your change management concepts. You've created this roadmap. You've created a timeline on the project management side. You have been communicating with your people. You've communicated with your leadership. You have thought about a training plan such that there will be less resistance to implementing the new technology that you're going to be implementing. That there will be less resistance to implementing that new technology. And now you have not only determined what your outcomes are going to be, but you have a real objective measure by which you can determine what success will be. So here's where the bad news is, or the difficult part is that it's, a long slog. And sometimes digital transformation projects can take 6 weeks. Sometimes they take 6 months. Sometimes they take 2 years. Sometimes they are multi-phased because they are not just one process that we are looking to change, but they can be, multiple that are gatekeeping unto another. This is where that resistance management takes effect, and making sure that people don't get change fatigue, being really mindful about that communication, being mindful about keeping people aware of what our goals were in the beginning, what the problems were that we were looking to affect change with this project, and how along the way we have actually made things better, or how we have unearthed certain new issues that are going to be addressed over the course of our project. There's risk management, because clearly, as we are diverting our focus perhaps from our 9-to-5 jobs, there's going to be some elements of, there's going to be some elements that people can only pay attention to, so many things at so many times. So there's going to be perhaps a certain heightened element of risk about our day-to-day jobs. But the flip side of that is that by the essence of doing these projects, we are inherently lowering the risk to the organization based on whatever it is that this project is designed to oversee, or more efficiently provide to do, or be able to automate. And so being able to communicate the benefits of lower risk and risk mitigation to the organization is something, that needs to be not only communicated, but also needs to be seen through. And then lastly, and obviously the whole point of this conversation, ensuring that both your change manager and your change management path and your project management path are on the same page. Again, from my perspective, that's where that thread comes through, because this is not a set it and forget it. You may both start at the same point, if you remember one of the slides we had before, they were working in parallel. You need to make sure that they are continuing to work in parallel, and that's not an easy thing. It needs to be intentionally done. That's where continuous meetings with respect to having status updates, making sure that your change management individuals are still being in contact with your project management staff, making sure that all of this is being looped in with your senior leadership and communicating down as appropriate throughout the organization. That's how you're going to continue to have success. So this is where we talk about, contemplating, where to start in just identifying what are all of, as I mentioned before, this does not need to be an external concept. This can certainly be done by a well-motivated, well-meaning, individual or set of individuals at the organization. Andrew, did I get you back yet?
Yeah, I think so. Can you hear me?
Fantastic.
All right. So thinking about where to start as an organization, and really, there's no bad place to start. And I think a few of these are here. And I think, as I heard Karina said, as I was trying to refresh, it doesn't necessarily have to be outside. It can be looking from within. And we see a lot of organizations is kind of figuring out the best place to, and start at the base. What is working and what is not? I think the key to good change management is not just figuring out what you need help with, but figure out what's working, because you don't want to throw out the processes that are working or the things that are working. We find a lot with nonprofits, sometimes on the operation ends, things can be a little disjointed, and one division or department might be doing something a little differently. And maybe that would work if it was just uniform across the board. So I think sitting down as an organization and figuring out what's working, what's not, and then developing that strategic plan for move forward and working together. I think it all comes back to the one thing to take away from here is, if you want good change management, it comes back to communication and talking amongst your organization and getting that buy-in, whether it's that third organization-wide survey. Hey, what's working and what's not? It can be as general as that. And we see a lot of times, sometimes they get a little more in depth, but or hey, we're putting together a steering committee for digital transformation. Would you like to be a part of it, and why? And just, you never know who's going to be able to bring something new to the table and be able to help you really supercharge. So there's a few ideas of where to start, but sometimes it's just, let's just sit down over lunch and get some people together and just brainstorm, because you never know what's going to come out of there, and you never know where the best place to start. And sometimes it's small changes, if you get that organization buy-in, can really grow into those big, massive changes. Just giving some ideas of where to start. And then just to bring it back to our objectives from today, hope we've defined why project management and change management are a little different. I think the best changes we see, those go hand in hand. You can't really do one without the other to really get that buy-in, to avoid all those pitfalls and really work well together. Identify those good project management and change management tips and tricks, how you can make that a smoother digital transformation. I think the key is, like I keep coming back to, it's not going to be linear, but being able to kind of slim down those peaks and valleys is really what you're looking for, and really to end up at the end of the day what you need. And then hopefully you've gotten some tips of where to start within your organization, whether it's talking to us, having a steering committee, just having a lunch, and hey, everybody just throw ideas at the wall of what's not working or what we can do better. That's sometimes the best place to start, because sometimes, especially sitting in a management role, you don't know what your staff are having problems with. And sometimes just bringing to the table, let's throw everything at the wall, and now let's take all the things they wrote and figure out where those are really not symptoms, but problems. Let's get back to the main cause of all these symptoms. And that's really what we see is a great starting point. I thank everybody for, I'll turn it over to Karina for closing remarks, but I thank everybody for putting up with our technical difficulties. But Karina, anything to add before we sign off?
No, I think that Andrew basically said it all. I would say that, my high level takeaway is just remember that change management and project management are not set it and forget it, that it needs to continually be monitored together. And if you do that and keep that intentionally in mind, then that's when we've seen the most successful projects and the most successful, teamwork happen. And if you have any further questions, then our nonprofit digital technology strategy and innovation team would be happy to talk with you. Either Andrew and I would be happy to talk with you. And we very much thank you for your patience and for joining us today.